A humble man enrolls in flight school and is mocked by instructors and students alike, until one day, he reveals his true identity as their flight inspector. What happens next will leave you speechless. James Carter stepped off the bus with a quiet grace, his well-worn leather briefcase tucked securely under his arm. The morning sun glinted off the polished hangars of Falcon Aviation Academy, and the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the unmistakable scent of jet fuel. It was a strange juxtaposition. The modern, sleek planes and the older, more rugged air of the academy, where the smell of grease and oil seemed to cling to the walls. A place where young pilots dreamed of the skies, their future soaring far beyond the training fields below. Carter was not one to stand out. His clothes, simple and unassuming, marked him as an outsider. The khaki pants were faded from years of use, the plain white shirt creased as though it had been packed away for too long. The worn-out loafers, once a deep brown but now bleached by time, seemed more fitting for a retired schoolteacher than someone about to walk into the world of high-flying aviation. As he made his way toward the main building, heads turned, not with respect, but with amusement. The students, most in their crisp, clean uniforms, were quick to whisper to one another. A few snickered behind their aviator sunglasses, eyeing the old guy who was clearly out of place. They exchanged glances, sharing the unspoken joke that he must have wandered in by mistake. One instructor, a young man with a fresh, eager face, even approached him. "Excuse me," the instructor said, tapping Carter on the shoulder. "Are you lost? We're about to start the briefing for the new class. You need any help finding the cafeteria?" James looked up at the instructor, his calm eyes meeting the man's with an almost imperceptible smile. He didn't respond immediately, just nodded politely and shifted the briefcase to his other hand. The instructor, seemingly not expecting this silence, awkwardly nodded back before walking away in a hurry, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary on the strange newcomer. Carter didn't react. He wasn't here to make a scene, after all. He wasn't here to learn how to fly. That much was clear the moment he'd stepped onto the academy's grounds. No, James Carter had seen the inside of an aircraft more times than he could count. He had been in situations most people would never dream of, his hands on the controls during moments of absolute chaos. But this wasn't about flying. He had come for something else. It was only when a group of students approached the hangar that he made his way inside. They were laughing together, their chatter echoing off the walls. James caught snippets of their conversation as they passed him by. Nothing important, just young men boasting about their latest flight hours and the flashy gadgets on their new headsets. They were too wrapped up in themselves to notice him at all. To them, he was nothing more than a ghost, a man who didn't belong. The academy was abuzz with the usual pre-training chaos. A few young men stood outside the briefing room, discussing their assignments, while others fiddled with their phones. James walked slowly through the corridor, eyes scanning the walls and the faces of those around him. He took in everything, the layout of the space, the tightness of the uniforms, the arrogance that some of the students wore like armor. A few sharp-eyed instructors noticed him then. His posture, the subtle way he moved, the alertness that seemed to radiate from him even when he appeared to be simply strolling down the hall. But they didn't question it. They didn't ask who he was or why he was there. They simply nodded and went about their business. As he passed a classroom, one student, a lanky guy named Kevin, caught sight of him and did a double take. Kevin was the kind of student who stood out among the rest, not for his skills, but for his need to be noticed. His confidence bordered on arrogance, and he wasted no time in making sure that anyone in the vicinity was aware of it. "Hey, Grandpa!" Kevin called out, loud enough for the others to hear. The students nearby laughed. "Lost? Need me to show you where the cafeteria is?" James didn't flinch. He didn't look over. His face remained unchanged, calm, even serene. It wasn't the first time he'd been mocked, and it wouldn't be the last. But the students didn't know. They didn't know the man they were laughing at. They didn't know who he was, what he had seen, or what he could do. Kevin's words had no impact. James simply kept walking, nodding once to a passing instructor before entering the classroom. Inside, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Students began to file into the classroom, and the noise of their chatter began to die down. The instructor, a middle-aged man named Mr. Lawrence, called the class to attention. James stood silently in the back, leaning against the wall, watching the others prepare for their first simulation. Minutes passed, and the room fell into a rhythm as the students started their flight drills. The simulator was set up in the corner, the hum of machinery filling the space. Kevin, eager to show off, was among the first to jump into the cockpit. He was overly confident, pushing buttons with exaggerated movements, a smirk plastered on his face. James stood by, observing the way Kevin fumbled with the controls. It was clear to James that the young man had no real understanding of the delicate balance required to fly an aircraft. He was more concerned with appearing skilled than actually mastering the craft. The simulation began. Kevin's voice cracked over the intercom, giving instructions to his fellow students as if he were the lead pilot. A few minutes in, the machine sputtered, then shut off. The screen blinked red, indicating a malfunction. "Crap," Kevin muttered, looking around in a panic. James didn't move immediately. He took a breath, his eyes focused on the simulator, noting the small details, the blinking error code, the way the system had short-circuited. Slowly, he stepped forward and raised his hand. "Let me take a look," he said in a low voice. The students in the room paused, some whispering among themselves. Kevin shot him a glance, clearly annoyed but too embarrassed to protest. "You know anything about computers, old man?" he shot back, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Without answering, James walked over to the console. His hands were steady as he entered a few commands. The students gathered behind him, watching in silent confusion. Within moments, the screen blinked back to life, the simulation returning to normal. Kevin stood there, his mouth slightly agape. "You're good with computers?" he stammered. James simply nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's part of the job." He returned to his seat without further explanation. The room remained silent. The students had seen something they hadn't expected. But even as the instructors exchanged questioning looks, no one asked James about his experience. No one spoke up to inquire further. And so the day passed, with James silently observing, always watching, always learning. While the students continued to focus on their drills, they were still unaware of the truth, still blind to the fact that the quiet, unassuming man in the back of the room wasn't just another student. He wasn't there to be taught. He was there to teach them all a much-needed lesson. The third day of training began with a familiar buzz of excitement as the students filed into the classroom at Falcon Aviation Academy. A new lesson, a new challenge. Everyone was eager to prove themselves. Among them, James Carter sat in his usual spot, tucked into the back of the room. His quiet presence was almost invisible amidst the chatter and the rustling of flight manuals. He had already learned to keep to himself, observing the chaos of youth and ambition around him. Kevin, a trainee known for his cocky attitude, spotted James the moment he entered the room. A wide grin spread across Kevin's face, and he made his move. He sauntered up to the back of the room, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Grandpa, you lost? Or just looking for the cafeteria?" The room erupted with laughter. James, as always, gave no immediate reaction. His calm eyes met Kevin's for a brief moment, but he said nothing. The laughter continued, but it didn't faze James in the slightest. He simply nodded politely, accepting the mockery without breaking his composed demeanor. But the class was in for a surprise. As the morning proceeded, the flight simulator, a high-tech machine used to train the students, suddenly malfunctioned during Kevin's session. The control panel flickered, and the system shut down, leaving Kevin scrambling. The instructor looked up from his clipboard, unsure of what to do. The room fell silent, the laughter replaced by an awkward tension. Kevin struggled, tapping frantically on the screen, but nothing happened. James watched from his seat, his calm gaze unblinking. The instructor glanced around, unsure whether to call for technical support or let the students figure it out. Without a word, James stood up and walked toward the malfunctioning simulator. His steps were measured, deliberate, the soft click of his worn-out loafers echoing through the room. When he reached the machine, the others watched in confusion. He didn't hesitate. His hands moved with purpose, tapping a few keys on the console. In mere seconds, the screen flickered back to life, and the simulator was fully functional again. Kevin blinked, stunned. "You good with computers or something?" he asked, trying to save face with a nervous chuckle. James gave a small smile, but said nothing. He simply returned to his seat, once again becoming an unnoticed part of the background. The instructors exchanged glances, a subtle shift in their attitude. They had all been briefed that a surprise inspection was coming, but they hadn't expected it in the form of this unassuming man with scuffed shoes and an air of mystery. Still, no one said anything, and the session continued, albeit with a newfound tension in the room. Later that afternoon, the stakes were raised as the class gathered for a drill. It was time to test the students' reaction to an engine failure scenario, something that had become a standard exercise in the Academy's rigorous curriculum. The students were all eager to prove their skills, each one hoping to show off their ability to think quickly under pressure. James, who had been quietly observing, was paired with another student, a young man named Alex. The instructor, a seasoned pilot named Captain Reynolds, stood by the simulator, preparing to initiate the emergency sequence. "All right, team, this is a simulated engine failure. What you do next could save your life and the lives of your passengers. Stay sharp and trust your training," Captain Reynolds instructed. With that, the simulator was activated. The digital cockpit lights blinked red, signaling the failure of the engine. The control panel began to flash warnings, the simulation plunging the virtual aircraft into a rapid descent. The students in the room leaned forward, watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Alex grabbed the controls, hands shaking slightly, his focus narrowing on the flashing lights. But it was clear he was panicking. His hands fumbled over the buttons, unsure of the sequence he should follow. The plane continued its descent, and the tension in the room mounted as the simulator's speed increased. Kevin watched from the back, his earlier mockery forgotten, as he realized the situation was much more serious than he had anticipated. James, in the co-pilot seat, remained calm. His hands rested lightly on the armrests, his eyes tracking the simulation without a hint of fear. He could feel the pressure mounting around him, but he didn't allow it to affect him. His mind worked quickly, already assessing the situation, already calculating the best course of action. When Alex failed to make the correct adjustment, James leaned forward, his hand hovering near the controls. Alex turned toward him, his face full of panic. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. James's voice was calm, reassuring. "Relax," he said, his tone steady and authoritative. "You have to control the descent first. Then we stabilize the plane." Without waiting for further instruction, James took over. His hands moved with precision, his fingers adjusting the throttle, flipping the switches with practiced ease. The plane in the simulation began to level out, its descent slowing as James guided it back under control. The room fell silent as the virtual aircraft stabilized, the engine failure scenario successfully averted. Captain Reynolds stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide in disbelief. The other students stared, mouths agape. The simulator screen showed a safe landing, a perfect recovery from what had initially seemed like a dire emergency. James didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the stunned silence. He simply leaned back in his seat, folding his arms, as if the event had been a routine practice for him. His face remained stoic, but inside, his mind was already processing the next challenge, the next test. The instructor, after a long pause, finally spoke. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, his voice almost a whisper. He turned to the class, eyes scanning the group. "Remember, in aviation, you never know who might have the skill to save you. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones you should be paying attention to." Kevin, still in shock, avoided James's gaze. The laughter from earlier seemed distant now, the harsh reality of his own failure hitting him hard. He couldn't help but feel a mix of embarrassment and awe. Who was this man, really? What had he just witnessed? As the class ended for the day, the whispers began. Who is he? Where did he come from? Is he really just a student? The questions circulated as the students filed out of the room, still processing what had just happened. James, however, remained seated, his expression unreadable. Little did they know the truth was coming, and it would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet man with the scuffed shoes. The air in the hangar was thick with an uneasy silence. The students stood in tightly knit groups, casting curious glances at each other, while the instructors shuffled nervously at the edges of the room. Even the smell of oil and metal, usually comforting to those who spent their days surrounded by planes, seemed off today. There was a buzz in the air, a tension that none of them could shake. The students had been told to assemble for a special announcement, but no one knew exactly what it was about. The instructors, too, wore expressions of uncertainty, their eyes darting between the group of trainees and the stage at the front, where the director stood with a stern expression. James Carter, seated at the back of the crowd, could feel their eyes on him. He hadn't made any attempts to stand out. Instead, he had kept to himself all week. He had remained in the shadows, observing, learning. Today, however, he had become the center of attention in a way that he never wanted. He sat still, his worn-out shoes scuffing against the concrete floor, his posture rigid yet relaxed, calm in the face of the inevitable reveal. The director cleared his throat, stepping forward into the silence. The spotlight seemed to dim the rest of the room, focusing all attention on him as he spoke. "Attention, everyone," the director said, his voice carrying over the room. "I have an important announcement. As part of the Aviation Regulatory Board's ongoing inspections, we've had the privilege of hosting a special guest this week. Please welcome Mr. James Carter." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. James didn't stand, didn't acknowledge the applause or questions that immediately arose. His name didn't mean anything to them, not yet. The students exchanged confused looks, whispers bouncing between them like the fluttering wings of trapped birds. What was going on? Kevin, who had been one of the most vocal in his mockery of James earlier in the week, leaned toward his friend, nudging him with a smirk. "Must be some kind of janitor or something. They probably pulled him from the maintenance crew." But before Kevin could finish his sentence, the director continued, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a sharp blade. "Mr. James Carter," the director said, pausing for emphasis, "has logged over 15,000 flight hours, served as an Air Force test pilot, and trained half the inspectors in our region. He's not here to learn. He's here to evaluate every single one of you." The room went dead silent. Kevin's face drained of color, his smirk faltering. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the words. The others followed suit, some shifting uncomfortably on their feet, others frozen in place, eyes wide. James sat unmoving, his expression a perfect mask of professionalism, but inside, his heart quickened. He had seen this reaction before, the disbelief, the shock, the dawning realization. It was always the same. The director gestured to James, who now stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked toward the front of the hangar, feeling every eye follow him, and every whisper fade into the background. His feet were light on the floor, but the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. As he reached the front, the director stepped aside, nodding to him in acknowledgement. James took the microphone, his hand steady as he adjusted it to his height. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and firm, just like the man they had all mistaken for an old, harmless man. "I don't expect any applause," James said, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. "And I certainly don't need your respect. But I do expect something much more valuable: humility." He paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. A few of the students shifted nervously, but no one dared to speak. The tension was palpable. "Respect," James continued, "is earned, not given. It's not about the clothes you wear, the car you drive, or the title you hold. It's about what you bring to the table. Some of you have already learned this lesson the hard way. Others, well, you still have time. James' eyes swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the students one by one. Kevin, who had laughed at him just days before, was now standing rigid, his mouth dry, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes darted nervously around the room, unable to meet James's gaze. The others, too, seemed suddenly aware of the weight of their previous actions. "The skies are unforgiving," James continued, his tone a bit sharper now. "What you wear here doesn't matter. What you can do with what you've learned, and the professionalism you display, is all that matters." He stepped back from the microphone, casting one last glance over the room. His eyes lingered on Kevin for a moment longer than the others, a subtle message conveyed in the silent exchange. Kevin, embarrassed and ashamed, finally dropped his gaze. The director took the microphone back, his voice shaky as he tried to recover from the unexpected shift in tone. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. We will continue with the inspection process tomorrow. Everyone, please return to your training stations." As the students began to file out, there was an air of uncertainty. No one spoke. Some looked over their shoulders, as though unsure if they could trust what they had just heard. James remained at the front for a moment, watching them leave. When the last of the students had cleared the room, he turned to the director, his face softening slightly. "You've got a good group here, but there's a lot of work to be done," James said, his voice now more reflective than before. "I'll make sure they know," the director replied, nodding. James didn't smile, but there was a slight shift in his expression, a quiet satisfaction at the lessons already being learned. He turned and walked out of the hangar, his briefcase swinging lightly by his side. The day had been long, but it had only just begun. There was still much more to observe, to evaluate, and most importantly, to teach. As the last of the students filed out of the hangar, Kevin stood frozen in place, his eyes fixed on the empty space where James had been. A knot tightened in his chest, a mixture of embarrassment, guilt, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. He glanced down at his uniform, so pristine, so polished, and for the first time, he wondered how much of it was just a facade. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more opportunities for him to prove himself. But that was the thing about respect. It wasn't something you could just buy or earn with a uniform or a joke. It had to be earned with actions. And Kevin knew deep down that he had a lot of work to do. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight issues of prejudice and the importance of treating everyone with respect. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and encourage meaningful discussions about equality and professionalism in educational environments.